A very warm welcome to all of you. Today's lecture is on the empirics of migration. So this will be particularly useful for people who might be planning a research project around migration. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through my own work on Bihar migration that culminated into a book titled Migration and Development in India, The Bihar Experience. So this work was done at the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi, and as a part of my PhD at the International Institute of Social Studies. Now, the South Asia edition of this book was published in 2024. So before I take you through the key findings and arguments of the book, I just want to say that this book has been a long time in the making. And in 2009, I started working on a research program on inclusive development in rural Bihar. And since then, I've been involved in subsequent surveys and resurveys that took place in 2011 and 2016 in the same set of 12 and 36 villages spread across 7 districts in rural Bihar. So very early on, I started working on migration. I was really fascinated by what was going on in Bihar, so much so that I decided to do a PhD in development studies, working in the broad area of migration and development. So what this book does is it uses data from the same set of villages and households from 1998-99 that already existed at IHD, and then data from 2009 and 2011, which is from the resurveys in which I was involved with. And then some data was collected in 2014 as a part of my PhD. And then again, there was a resurvey in 2016, which for the first time had a component of a special migration module to better understand the patterns and dynamics of migration. So the book puts together all of this work. And then, of course, we had COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when internal migration really came to the forefront of the public discourse. And this book also helps us understand the crisis of migration during COVID, and also highlights the structural nature of migration, which is why this crisis also may not be resolved anytime soon. So in the presentation today, this presentation flows from the structure of the book. And I obviously don't have time to cover everything, so I'll give you some glimpses of the book. First of all, this book is a multidisciplinary endeavor, and it does 3 broad things. The first thing that it does is it traces the state discourses on rural-urban migration in India since the 1930s, and it critically analyzes industrial, labor, and rural and urban development programs and policy. Now, this is broadly covered in chapter 2 of the book after the introductory chapter. The second thing that the book does is that through data on longitudinal surveys undertaken in rural Bihar, like I told you, in 1999, 2011 and 2016, it examines the characteristics of migration in chapter 3, and then changes in patterns of migration and sources of income in chapter 4, and then it estimates the determinants and impacts of migration in chapter 5. So this work is largely rooted in an economic framework, and it offers a source area perspective of migration. The third thing that the book does is, based on fieldwork in the village and the city, in the 6th and 7th chapters, it presents an in-depth account of a rural-urban migration stream in contemporary India. It focuses on young people's experience of this migration, and it finds that this migration is embedded in the household and family dynamics of the source household. And this work is largely qualitative, and it tries to integrate source and destination area perspectives of the migrants. And in doing so, it draws on the disciplines of sociology and human geography. And finally, I conclude with some policy implications from this research, and particularly contrasting the state discourses with the empirical evidence presented in this book. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the introduction, but by now in this course, you're familiar with the context of internal migration in India, where for long there's been a dominant academic and policy narrative of low internal migration. And one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic did was it countered this narrative. When you had millions and millions of migrants stranded across the country, this narrative of low internal migration in India was countered. So, early demographers like Kingsley Davis, they attribute low migration to the predominance of agriculture as a source of livelihood, as well as the prevalence of early marriage, the joint family, and the caste system. And then you have economists like Kaivan Munshi and Mark Rosenzweig, who attribute low levels of permanent migration from the rural areas to subcaste or jati networks. So what they argue is that these local risk-sharing networks provide mutual insurance to their members and therefore they restrict their mobility. There's also recent work by Zhavanga Kohn and colleagues at the World Bank who argue that interstate migration in India is limited, and this is constrained by political boundaries of state borders because state governments provide entitlements, they provide domicile, preferential access to education and public employment. So if someone migrates, they lose out on all of these entitlements and so on, and therefore migration in India is limited. We also know very well that official data sets such as the Census of India and the NSS also corroborate this low rural to urban migration. So this is one part of the story. The other part of the story, however, is that at the same time we have empirical studies, we have micro studies across the country that report high levels of mobility. So, be it Diane Coffey and her colleagues in Western India, or the IHT, IIPA studies in Eastern India, the Kerala and Tamil Nadu surveys in Southern India by Irudya Rajan and his colleagues, and our own work in Orissa, it's increasingly becoming clear that rural to urban labor migration is fundamental to a service-oriented urban economy that demands labor that comes from rural India. Now, this increase in the levels of mobility was also seen in the economic survey, and in 2017, the Economic Survey of India in 2017 had the first ever chapter on internal migration. By the way, it was also the last ever chapter on internal migration, and this chapter acknowledges that official data sets underestimate migration. So therefore, it's not surprising that the Working Group of Migration noted that estimates of internal migrants vary widely and they are fraught with methodological concerns, and these need to be addressed carefully and institutionally in an evidence-informed manner. So let us now come to state discourses on rural-urban migration in India. In this chapter, I look at policy and program documents, two important reports of the colonial state, which are the Whitley Commission report and the Rege Committee report, 5-year plan documents, Labour Commission reports of the Indian state, to present state discourses on rural-urban migration in India since the 1930s. So it emerges very clearly that while rural-urban migration was an important policy question in pre-independent India, state policy became increasingly silent about this migration in the post-independence decades. And then there emerged a fundamental contradiction in the state's discourse that industrialization was necessary for development, but migration was not desirable. Then there was the state-sponsored Green Revolution in northwestern India that sustained on agricultural labor migration from the poorer states. And the Labour Commission report highlights the plight of migrant agricultural workers. And in the post-liberalization period, which is post-1991, however, there's been a growing recognition that migrants are clearly important actors in an economic sense. However, there's a clear underlying disconnect between urbanization and migration. Now, why is this so? So, on the one hand, in the state's discourse, urbanization is clearly desirable. And like I mentioned, often the state's view on migration remains ambivalent. And rural and urban policies tend to be mutually exclusive, except they both frame migration as a problem. Now, why is migration framed as a problem? So, on the one hand, it's argued that unending migration of the rural poor to the urban areas may have a destabilizing effect on urbanization, and its sustainability. Then it's argued that migration puts a severe stress on civic infrastructure, and migration is seen to have resulted in the growth of urban slums. So therefore, one of the key goals of the state's urban development policies is to check migration to the metropolises. And the recurring theme that migration is a problem emerges both in rural and urban policy discourses, and therefore state policies often explicitly aim to stop migration. Then there's the point about multiple actors in the federal state. So this, in India we have a federal state, you have a government at the center, and then you have various governments at the state level. So India's federal structure creates a vertical segmentation between the central and provincial governments. And each one of these actors is likely to have a different look on migration. At times, they even may contradict one another. So the first actor is the source government, say that of the sending state of Bihar, for instance. Now, in recent years, contrary to empirical evidence that there is an increasing out-migration from Bihar, so the first actor is the source government, say that of the sending state of Bihar, for instance. In recent years, contrary to empirical evidence, there is a sense that out-migration from Bihar is declining from the state. And this is reflected not only in the political rhetoric, but also in official documents of the state. Now, against this backdrop of high economic growth in Bihar, it is in the interest of the state to claim that migration has declined on account of local development. What about the state at destination? Now, labor laws mandate that the host state protect migrant workers, safeguard their rights. And ironically, host governments are generally infamous for their hostility towards migrant workers. You have many nativist movements, ethnocentric movements that rear their ugly head on account of the migrant-native divide, which is embedded in the politics of internal migration in India. And we also now have new nativist laws in several states. And of course, additionally, there is no acknowledgement of the migrants' contribution to the local economy. It's absent from the development discourse in the destination state. So now what about the central government? The official data collection machinery grossly underestimates migrant workers. And it is these national statistics that contribute to the invisibility of migrant workers. And then in addition, there is horizontal segmentation within the central governments. Rural and urban development ministries and their policies and programs tend to operate in silos. And so therefore, the rural and the urban tend to be mutually exclusive in the state's imagination and policy. So in turn, this chapter really suggests that it's the rural-urban dialectic and the diversity and the segmentation of state actors in a federal structure that contributes to contradictory state narratives, and then ultimately leads to the absence of a coherent discourse on rural-urban migration in India. So this chapter suggests that it is this rural-urban dialectic and the diversity and segmentation of state actors in the federal structure that contributes to contradictory state narratives and ultimately leads to an absence of a coherent discourse on rural-urban migration in India. Now, coming to the results of the empirical study. So, this is like I was telling you earlier, these are surveys undertaken in 1999, 2011 and 2016, and these surveys have been undertaken in 7 representative districts of rural Bihar. I am not going into the details of the sampling, they are all there in the book and they can also be found elsewhere, and they have been used in the earlier A.N. Sinha Institute of Social Studies and IHD surveys, and the data has been collected from 1,588 households in 2016, 904 households in 2009-11 and 891 households in 98 and 99, and these are the same households, so the data is longitudinal, and as you can see the study districts are Gaya, Gopalganj, Madhubani, Nalanda, Purnia Raria and Rohtas. So coming to the results of the surveys. So what is the incidence of migration from rural Bihar? So before we get to the incidence, let me just tell you what the definition of a migrant in the survey is. So a migrant is any member who has been away from the rural household in the last 1 year for any duration of time. They are considered migrants, right? And so our surveys clearly show that migration has increased phenomenally. In 1999, on the whole, 45% of the households had at least one migrant. This increased to 62% in 2011 and to 65% in 2016. So we have nearly 2 in 3 households that have migrant members in 2016. And you can also see that there is variation by district, by caste, by class and other social categories. And migration is relatively lower in peasant households. Migration is relatively lower in peasant households, OBC2 castes, and this is largely because these are households that are more involved in agriculture. But as you can see, over time as we move from 1999 to 2016, there's been a convergence of migration across caste categories, across class categories, and also across the districts of North and South Bihar. We also find that migration has become longer term. So one of the questions that was asked in the survey was, for how many months do migrants migrate in the last 12 months, right? So you can see that the percentage of migrants migrating for more than 8 months in a year increased from 43% in 1999 to 61% in 2011 to 77% in 2016. So you see, more than 3 in 4 migrant workers from rural Bihar are actually away for more than 8 months in a year. And now we can see more clearly what is the, if we look at the number of months they migrated in the last 12 months, you can clearly see that 2 in 3 workers are away for more than 10 months in a year. And so this is really long-term circular migration. I'm not showing the employment data here, but a majority of workers work only at destination. They're not linked with the rural labor market in any way. And the destinations are predominantly urban destinations. Let us now look at the incidence of migration by sex. And you can see very clearly that migration is gendered, migration streams are very clearly masculinized, and so in 1998-99, you can see that among all men, 26.8% were migrant, whereas for females, this number was as low as 3.2%. So when I say among all men, I'm taking the working age men in the age 15 to 64 years. And then you can see how the share of migrants among males increased to 47.4% in 2011 and then went on to 47.5% in 2016. So you can see that, nearly 1 in 2 men in the age 15 to 64 are migrants, whereas the share of women is much, much lower. At about 6.4%. So then migration streams are masculinized, men go to distant urban labor markets to work, and women stay behind to care for the homes and farms and children and the elderly. So because of this, what we also find is that there is a feminization of agriculture. The share of women workers in agriculture is much higher than the share of male workers in agriculture. The proportion of women working in agriculture, the proportion of women workers in agriculture is much higher than the proportion of male workers in agriculture. Now, in this graph, you can also see that migration is youth dominated. So this is, we're looking at migration by age cohort and sex, and you can clearly see how migration peaks in the age 25 to 29, after which it tapers. So migrant workers eventually return to the village, not to retire, but to work again. And the rural labor market is also less demanding than the urban economy. And so therefore, for the rural urban migrant, migration is a function of sex. It's also a function of life cycle. And in the econometric analysis in the book, we find that both age and sex are important markers. They're important determinants of migration over time, and therefore it also reflects the increasing demand for casual labor at migrant destinations across India. Now, the survey also tried to capture rural household income, and this is based on an annual income accounting exercise, and we have 4 heads here. So, first we have agricultural incomes, and agricultural incomes include net income from self-employment in agriculture and livestock, and also income from agricultural labor. The second head is non-agricultural income. This includes net income from self-employment, income from casual labor in non-agriculture, and income from salary in non-agriculture. The third head is government programs. This includes income from casual labor in government programs, and we also have, imputed government transfers. And the last is the income from remittances. And what we need to note here is that remittances are only that part of a migrant's income that are sent back to the rural household. So we don't include the entire income the migrant earns at destination. We only include that part of a migrant's income that they are sending back to the rural household. So now we look at the changes in income sources between 1999 and 2016, right? So you can see there are 2 types of households. NM, these are the non-migrant households, and M are the migrant households, right? So let us look at the case of agricultural income from self-employment, right? And we can see that this has declined. So this is the blue here and the blue here, and we can see that it declined in both migrant and non-migrant households. Now, why might this be so? So the first thing, of course, is that the cost of cultivation have increased tremendously, and so therefore for more and more peasants, cultivation is becoming less and less remunerative. And we can also see this in the relatively lower increase in income of households in the peasant classes over time compared to agricultural laboring classes and non-agricultural classes. So therefore, households that are able to exit agriculture tend to do so. The second, now we look at the share of livestock income, right? You can see that's the orange. So you can see that there is also a decline in the share of livestock income, but that is more muted. And now we come to attached labor. Attached labor is this yellow that you see here, which is there in 1999. It's very marginally there in 2011, and by the time we come to 2016, this has completely disappeared. So attached labor, which was present in some pockets of North Bihar, has now virtually disappeared by 2016. And then we have a substantial increase in non-agricultural income, right? And so you can see a substantial increase in non-agricultural income, and non-agricultural income increased from 15% to 30%. So this is quite phenomenal, right? So you have so you have this blue here, which is self-employment and non-agriculture, and the green here, which is wage employment and non-agriculture. So you can see how this has largely kind of, the share here and the share here has increased tremendously. And so what we see is, I've discussed this further in the book, that it's households in the upper income quintiles that have disproportionately been able to move out of agriculture And however, poorer households, particularly households that are exclusively dependent on agricultural activities for their livelihood, they are stuck in the lower quintile. So therefore, at first, being able to move away from the local economy or migration is a pathway to higher income and a movement away from poverty. And when we estimate the impacts of migration, we find that remittances contribute significantly to increase household income. However, at the same time, income from local non-agricultural sources can be another way to escape poverty, but this is much less accessible to those in the lower income classes. So therefore, the picture that we get is one where migration is broad-based, migration is accessed by a majority of households across castes, across classes, and however, on the other hand, access to non-agricultural work is very narrow, and only those in the upper echelons of the society are able to better access this route. So clearly, if you look at remittances, and you can see how the share of remittances in migrant households is so high, and you can also see how it's increased over time. Now, what about government programs? Now, several government programs that were operational in 2011, 2016, they did not exist in 1999, right? So, income from government transfers and casual employment have appeared on the radar, and what we find is very clearly that there is a positive targeting of government program, and that's a good thing, and the share of income from these sources is much higher for those in the lower quintiles and also in female-headed households. So the overall story that emerges is that, in sum, for rural households, migration of its members is a pathway to higher income, and households with migrants report a higher annual income than households without migrants. And there have also been major changes in the composition of income, right? So you've had a decline of agricultural income, and there's been a simultaneous increase of non-farm income, of remittances, and this points towards some livelihood diversification in the rural areas. But however, what we also find is that as migration deepened, as remittances increased, agriculture suffered. And by 2016, only about 20% of overall income came from agriculture. And even though we find the rural non-farm sector growing, but it was very constrained. And it was really unable to take off in the context of a lack of forward and backward linkages, where migration was both a cause and consequence of the lack of local development. And migration was near universal. More than 90% of all migrants send remittances, and remittances actually comprise 55% of the total income of households with migrants. So the other thing that the data suggests is that commuting is important. And just like migration, commuting, when people live in their homes, live in the rural areas, and they travel long distances for work, and they come back the same day. Right, so the residence is the same and their workplace is very far away, but they come back the same day. So the data suggests that commuting, like migration, is a pathway to higher income. And so villages that have a higher than average rate of commuting have a lower than average rate of migration. So whenever there are local employment opportunities available, people are willing to travel long distances to go to those. And therefore, the data, there is some evidence that commuting and migration may be substitutes. Right. So, until so far, what we've done is we've looked at the rural surveys. So, the analysis, in the first part of the presentation has looked at rural surveys. Now, one of the main limitations of this research was that the urban picture of rural-urban migration was missing. And in fact, as you know, most studies on migration examine it either at source or at destination. And these sort of, tend to be in silos, and there's very little empirical research that covers both the locations, which is the source and destination, the rural and the urban. So broadly motivated by this gap in the literature and the questions that emerge from the rural surveys, the next logical step for me was to expand the research location to the city, and so as to be able to synthesize source and destination perspectives and rural and urban perspectives on migration. So this part of the research is based on qualitative research, and the stream of migration that I studied was from Delhi to Mahisham, and so the source village was Mahisham. It was a remote village, it was a flood prone village that had traditional agriculture, little diversification in Madhubani district in Bihar, and the Madhubani Delhi migration corridor is one of the densest migration corridors in India. And Delhi was, I studied migrants in Delhi NCR, where there's been a steady increase in the share of Bihari migrants until 2016. And when you ask migrants why they go to Delhi, they say Delhi is closed, Delhi nazdeek hai, whereas it's 1100 kilometers from Mahisham to Delhi. So this part of the research is based on qualitative research. I draw from detailed case study materials and interviews based on fieldwork with 53 research participants, migrant workers in the city and their family members, and key informants in the village. Right. So I now come to migrants' work in the city. What is the nature of work that migrants do? What are the conditions of work? So economic activities of most migrants are interviewed can be located in Delhi's urban informal economy, that is local and global linkages. And migrants were employed in diverse sectors such as textiles, garments, piece rate work, transport, manufacturing, household and small industry, and petty entrepreneurship. Now, most of this work was riding on India's expanding economy, yet it remained at its fringes. Work conditions varied by industry and sector, but most work conditions were hazardous, and the migrants I interviewed worked in cramped spaces, and many faced health hazards. In some cases, the workplace and the residence was the same physical space. And it's ironic that many migrants left their home in the village to do home-based work in the city. We find that a 12-hour workday was the norm for wage workers, and self-employed workers worked much longer hours. None of the workers had a job contract or any benefits such as a provident fund or gratuity. No one had any form of social protection such as health insurance provided either by the employer or the state, nor was any worker a member of a labor organization. Most workers earn less than the stipulated minimum wage. In all cases, work that migrants did or the conditions in they worked, they bordered illegality or were simply illegal. However, workers were not aware of this. They were ignorant about their entitlements in an environment of lax implementation of labor laws. Now, work is adequate in a normal sense, but migrants expect extra work. They want to do more in order to maximize their income. But however, sometimes this is just not possible. Then we also have transitions from wage work to self-employment, and it emerged very clearly from migrant narratives that there was a preference towards own account work to wage work. However, not everyone was able to start their own enterprise or business. And all self-employed workers that I interviewed had started with wage work in the city. Now, while wage work was more prevalent, it offered little upward mobility. On the other hand, transition from wage work to entrepreneurship, it required taking risks, but it had its own rewards. Now, own account workers had a sense of accomplishment, the pride of apna kaam, something that they call their own work, and for having made it on their own. And it's very important to know here that, and I learned from this work that migrants' own subjectivities about self-employment are contrary to the accounts of self-employment in official discourses that often link it with poverty. Now, social networks emerged as very important for the migrants. Migrants were heavily dependent on their rural contacts and not institutional mechanisms, but not state mechanism or non-state mechanisms to access urban labor markets. Having said that, migrants remained concentrated in certain types of jobs, in certain types of occupations for years. And when asked why they did not consider changing jobs, the most frequent reply was that they did not have information about other job opportunities and they were comfortable in working with their fellow villagers. And they did not tread beyond familiar areas. It also appears then that social networks are then self-perpetuating. The same networks that facilitated their employment in the city perhaps also impede their prospects of better work. The other issue that emerged very clearly from the research was the problem of urban isolation. Migrants had limited interaction with the city. Their energies went into working hard, saving and remitting as much as they could to the rural household. So their social life was separated from their families in the village and it was marked by loneliness. Migrants had few outlets of leisure. On the weekly day off, most slept extra hours. And this rest was very important for them to be able to get back to another grueling week of work. Their schedule comprised working, eating, sleeping, and then working again, and little else. This is contrary to literature in other parts of Asia where, migrants experience and engage with the city much more. All the migrants I interviewed stayed in or around the workplace with friends, relatives, and fellow villagers. Their social world was constructed around a closely knit circle of kith and kin. It was as if the village was socially reproduced in the urban sprawl where they lived. They rarely ventured out of this domain. New migrants were attracted to places where old migrants were, and this in some ways led to a ghettoization of migrant spaces in the city. So while migrants were able to exploit economic opportunities offered by the city, it was evident that they worked in exploitative conditions. And now an important question that emerges is, why do rural migrants continue to let themselves get exploited in the city? Now the answer to this may lie in the dialectics of the village and the city. It's also concerned with the motivations of migration and the circularity of migration. Now, all migrants I had interviewed had internalized the feeling that they don't belong to the city. For them, the city is only a means of livelihood. What they get from the city is something that goes back to the village. So, urban income is a means to a better rural life. It is this rural-urban circulation and the belief that this circulation will eventually culminate in a final return to the village that continues to motivate them to work for monetary gains. Why do migrants expect so little from the city? And this is perhaps rooted in their perception of the transience of their own migration. And it's very useful here to refer to Arjun Appadurai's concept of the capacity to aspire. And Appadurai argues that marginal groups in society, and in this case we can consider Bihari migrants in Delhi, have a limited capacity to aspire. And this also then needs to be read with our earlier discussion that migrants preferred to live in this village if they had a choice. Earlier, social hierarchy in the village was directly linked with economic hierarchy mediated by the caste system. Now, over time, this has changed, with workers migrating from Mahesham in large numbers, and remittances have changed the balance of income in the village. So, workers continue to resist working in the village, particularly in traditional occupations such as agriculture. They desire alternative work in the village, are willing to do the work that they do in the city in the village, but they want to live outside the shadow of domination of the higher caste. I would like to argue that migrant laborers practice some sort of an economic rejection, but they want social acceptance in the village. And migrants indeed want to live in the village if work in the domain of their dignity is available. I now conclude with policy implications against the findings of this empirical work. So, the first thing is that it's clearly evident that the state's approach towards migration is fundamentally opposite to the nature of the development process. While the state aims to contain, curb and reduce migration, its service-oriented economy demands cheap labor from rural areas, and this demand for labor has only increased over time. The second thing is that historically there has been an urban bias in the state's development strategy, and that most migrants return to the village after their working lives suggests that it's the rural areas that bear the cost of the production and reproduction of this labor, thereby subsidizing India's urban development. Now, closely related to this is the circularity of migration. And the circularity of migration is a norm due to the pull of the family from source regions, as well as the exclusionary processes of urbanization at destination. It's clear from the income data that migrants' remuneration at destination is often below statutory minimum wage and is inadequate for family migration or long-term settlement in the urban areas. Now, the circularity of migration also has implications for India's urbanization project, which remains excruciatingly low at 31%. And our sluggish rural to urban transition is very closely intertwined with the circularity of migration that in turn, is an impediment to the country's desired structural transformation. The third thing is that migrants live at the margins of the city. There is very little acknowledgement of their contribution to the economy. And to the contrary, they are often blamed for social problems in destination states. There is evidence of backlash towards labor from poor regions in prosperous regions, and time and again you have sons of soil movement that rear their ugly head, and xenophobic tendencies persist towards migrant workers. And this is in clear violation of constitutional guarantees and the law of the land. The fourth thing is that policy discourses paint migrants to be passive victims. Now, empirical evidence presented in this book highlights that migration can be beneficial. Despite discrimination, despite exploitation in the labor market, migrants exercise their agency and make informed decisions about their work and life. So, therefore, migration can be hugely beneficial in economic terms, but there is an enormous social cost of migration that finds little mention in the policy discourse. And this is the separation from family members that migrants must endure, so as to be able to reap the benefits of the additional income that migration provides. And finally, the state views its citizens as static, located either in rural areas or in urban areas. And this research demonstrates that migrant workers traverse rural and urban spaces, industrial and agricultural work, and therefore there is an urgent need to incorporate multiple spatialities in the state's development project and development programs, including the portability of benefits associated with various government programs. So, I will stop there. Thank you very much. I hope you found this lecture useful, specifically for people thinking of doing research on migration, imagining research on migration. I hope some of this research process was helpful for you. Thank you.